The Holy Gospel is written in the 14th chapter of St. Luke, beginning at the first verse. On one occasion when Jesus was going to the house of the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down in the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then in disgrace you would start to take the lower place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when the host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and then you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. Of recognition and appreciation. That's what the gospel text is really about today. To put it in simple terms, it's about recognition and appreciation. When my son was young, we used to go up to the lake, it's in Minnesota, every summer and spend 1 or 2 weeks up there. And one of the things that was kind of the highlight when he was a young child was we'd go to Paul Bunyan land. Paul Bunyan, maybe some of you in the north don't know who Paul Bunyan was, but he was a giant woodsman in Minnesota myth and lore. He and his blue ox, Babe, removed a lot of the trees and cleared a lot of the forest so we could build things up there. But he was a legend. Paul Bunyan was an amusement park like you have down here. And one of the things that they did, besides the rides and the special attractions, one of the things that they did was when you walked in and you had a child with you, they would ask what the child's name was. And then when you got in, there was a special time when they greeted you. And Paul Bunyan would speak. And then one of the first things that happened was he started naming the names of the children. And my young son was so amazed when he said his name. He turned and he said, "Paul Bunyan knows who I am. How can he do that?" And he was so proud of it. The first time it happened, he went back home after the vacation was over and talked about the exploits that he had while he was fishing and swimming. And he said, then we went to Paul Bunyan land, and Paul Bunyan knew who I was. I can't wait to go back to see if he remembers me. Well, in the next 3 or 4 years, he was amazed to find out that Paul Bunyan remembered who he was. And then, for some strange reason, he knew special things about him, things he'd done, and whether this was the 3rd or 4th time he had come. And he was so amazed and so proud to be known by Paul Bunyan. It reminds me of a story told by Howard K. Smith. Howard K. Smith was one of the news anchors with Barbara Walters a long time ago in the 60s, ABC. And one of the things that he said was that his kids weren't particularly impressed by his position. That's a news anchor on one of the major channels was a real prominent position back in the 60s. But he said his kids never respected him. Not in terms of who knew him. When somebody would come up and kind of gush over him, they thought it was kind of silly. But he said, I was called to Los Angeles to cover the 1964 nominating convention. Said I took my children to a new amusement park called Disneyland. He said we went into Disneyland, and it wasn't long before we met Mickey Mouse. And he said, Mickey Mouse looked at me, and he said, my goodness, it's Howard K. Smith. And he said, there was just a new type of stature I had with my children, and they went and told everybody, Mickey Mouse knows my dad. We like to be recognized, don't we? We don't like to be some remote thing that nobody pays any attention to. Very often we try to work at things that will gain us recognition in a positive way. And sometimes it works in a negative way. Most of you have heard of Bernie Madoff. In 2008, Bernie Madoff was arrested. He was running a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is one where you get people to invest in something, and you pay good dividends to the people who join first, and then you begin to pay dividends to all the people who join with the people who join after them. And finally you get to a point where you have so many members because they had good experience in investing that you've got a whole lot of people that can't be paid, and then the Ponzi scheme comes falling down. When Bernie Madoff was arrested, he had garnered $35 billion from his investors. And all of a sudden, Bernie Madoff went from high esteem to nothing. His oldest son committed suicide. He lost all his possessions. He lost his social status. The family was ripped apart. And Bernie Madoff had nothing left. And the question was asked about him, why did he get involved in this? And I guess the obvious answer is greed. But there was something about his history that people pointed out time and time again who investigated him as a person. Said when Bernie was a child, he got no recognition at all. He was mediocre or a poor student at best. He was not handsome. He didn't get any dates. All the girls turned him down. He was not handsome. He was not athletic. He was not smart. He did not perform well in grades. There was one thing that Bernie could do, and that was make money. And it seems that's the only way he could gain any kind of status in his own eyes. And we look for status and try and pursue it directly. Scripture says you're going to take some wrong turns. Yesterday, again, we hear on the radio or watch on television another mass shooting. 5 dead, as far as I know, in western Texas. And it seems to be that some of these people are just motivated by the desire to be recognized. So they just aren't passed over as some non-being. At least I can have some idea that people know who I am. And this motivates a lot of bad things. As Scripture says, if you pursue it directly, it'll lead you down some wrong paths. There's an interesting study done by Harvard University, and very often I look at the studies that they do and they seem kind of irrelevant. But they asked a number of people what they would prefer. Would you prefer to be earning $50,000 a year with all your neighbors around you earning $25,000? Or would you rather be earning $100,000 with all your neighbors earning $200,000? And surprisingly enough, the majority said they would rather be in a situation that they were earning more than their neighbors, even if it was earning less. We don't want to keep up with the Joneses or the Smiths. We want to be better than. We want some kind of notoriety. That was the first part of the parable. Jesus said there was this man that gave a banquet. And there were people that headed right off the bat for the most important spot. And in Jewish culture at that time, there was a very, very strict status in where you sat at the table. And he said, when you are operating as a human being, you don't search for the good parts. If you search for places of honor directly, it's going to lead you into some improper conduct. If you let others be held in esteem above you, it is going to reflect the Spirit of God, because then you will become a servant, rather one that is served. Jesus followed the first part of the parable with a second. And he gives a bit of whimsical advice about making the world a better place. And he said, this is about appreciation. This is about appreciation. Appreciation for those who can't give something back. He's in the parable, says, talk to the person who gave the banquet and said, oh, don't only invite people who are important in the world's eyes, who can give you something back. Be willing to give something to those who don't necessarily receive a lot of recognition, a lot of appreciation. There was an interesting comment that a woman made to her husband in one of the funerals. She looked at the flowers and she asked her husband, when I die, will you bring flowers? And he said, of course I will. And she said, you know what? When I die, I want to be able to appreciate the flowers. And maybe just once in a while I'm still alive, would you think about bringing me a flower? There was a cold silence. And then the person she addressed, husband, started to cry and said, I have been neglecting you, haven't I? The person sometimes who stands right next to you, the one that you eat with, the one that you work with at work. Sometimes they are the ones that need a little recognition and appreciation. We think we are pretty good at being humble and giving to others who make our lives richer, are real beneficial to us. And yet we forget. And sometimes in church, we forget those that don't hold the high places and appreciate them for being a part of our group, a part of our church. It is important, Christ says, to recognize and appreciate. One of the ministers Thursday in our study group gave an illustration about a church that was going to give an award for the most humble person in the congregation. And they announced it. They said, on this particular Sunday, we're going to honor the most humble person in our congregation. There were a lot of people that came to see who would be nominated and elected to this holy position because they were dealing with this particular text. And I said, when I heard the beginning of that story, I said, man, that's something that would go downhill in a real hurry, wouldn't it? And then the minister said, before we talk about the most humble person in the church, we're going to talk about the trophy. And he said, oh, by the way, we don't have a trophy. Because if you were nominated as the most humble person in this congregation and came down to accept the trophy, you wouldn't be the humblest person in the congregation. And if you were truly humble and wouldn't accept it, we wouldn't need the trophy anyway. So we didn't buy a trophy. To pay attention and care, to recognize and appreciate. We were talking about the kickball in school. I remember playing kickball, and I remember being chosen not first. And it hurt. There was one incident that I remember in all of sixth grade that was seemingly, it's just stuck with me the rest of my life. One of the real tough kids who was really one of the best athletes was captain that day. And there was one child in that class, his name was Donald, that he was always chosen last, every single time. When they chose both sides, he was chosen last. Didn't seem to care, didn't really go after the ball, didn't really kick seriously. And to everybody's surprise, when Billy Painter got up to make the selection, the first one he called on Donald. I selected him. Donald didn't even hear it because he was used to just waiting till the last anyway. And everybody said, Donald, he chose you. And he said, oh, he must be mistaken. He said, no, Bill said, I want you. You're my first pick. And that kid suddenly came alive. And he played and he did some good stuff. But he was so proud. And I said, wow, this person who we considered not somebody who was sensitive at all understood that somebody was bleeding in his class, who was laughed at, and considered a failure. And all of a sudden he made him a hero with a little bit of recognition and a little bit of appreciation. That's the message. It's written kind of in a way that we don't bring that out of it. But Jesus is telling us to not seek recognition directly. Recognition from God comes in the quiet, silent way we treat each other in our relationships in church, in the family, school, at work. And appreciation is shown when we recognize that everybody is equal and deserves some appreciation for what they add to your life. And then if you abide by these principles, Jesus says, I think the table that you will be invited to in eternity will be a round table. Amen.